My earliest recollections are as a toddler when we lived in Maywood, Illinois, which was a middle-class suburb west of Chicago, mostly working class people, but there was a middle class who owned the stores. Amongst them was the Jewish community. The paint store, Mr. Brown, the drugstore, Mr. Shupek, the grocery, Mr. Benjamin, the delicatessen, Mr. Samuelson, shoe store, Mr. Geyser, the orthodontist. They were all among the Jewish community. But my grandmother's home, which was home to many of her daughters, it was our turn at that time, was a very comfortable place on the corner of Washington Boulevard. The backyard had a cherry tree, an apple tree, a grape arbor from which my bubby made wine. Every Passover, you could smell the fermenting vat under the bed on the porch where it was being prepared for the months before Passover. Now, we children were not allowed to eat from the apple tree or the cherry tree or the grape arbor unless the fruit fell to the ground first. That's what we were allowed to have. My grandmother, when she said, "Tornit," mustn't, that was the law. Well, how did we get to Maywood? Let's go back to my grandmother, who had much fortitude. She was authoritative. She was resourceful. And she was brought up in the town of Lubavitch in Belarus, in Russia. Her father was a Rav, not a Rebbe who was an educated man, but an ordained rabbi, a Rav. When my grandmother was 13, and she being the oldest child and the only daughter, her mother died. And because the Rav never had any hand in domestic affairs, they were in their ivory towers with their books, my grandmother, 13, became the mistress of the home. She not only reared her little brothers, but she did all the washing in the river, on the rocks, baking the breads and the challahs, cooking, preserving food, making her own cheese. And she tells stories of how when the snow made high drifts, she would carry her little brothers from the age of 3 who went to cheder. She carried them on her back because they couldn't miss a day of cheder. Cheder, that's the schoolroom where the boys are taught Hebrew. I wonder now if perhaps that molded her personality, why she was imperious, why she was bossy. She had to attain that for survival. Anyway, when her father, the Rav, was very, very far-seeing, a visionary, because he educated his daughter. My grandmother was educated in Russian literature, some arithmetic, and Hebrew texts, and of course Yiddish. Well, a shidduch had to be made, a match, and the boy had to come also with great learning and prestige because she was the Rav's daughter. And Shmuel Tzivyan was imported from another town, and they didn't meet until their betrothal. Now, as strong-willed as my grandmother was, and as assertive as she was, that's how gentle and modest my grandpa was. Maybe that's the only way they could get together and live in safety. They settled in a little town called Illinois, also in Belarus. And I don't know how they acquired this, maybe a truck garden you'd call it in this country. I don't know if they owned the land or were leased it, but they lived off of their large garden. My grandmother preserved all the food. They had a horse because my grandfather was an itinerant teacher. He prepared all the Jewish boys in the villages around for yeshiva. Now, my grandmother, besides raising 12 children and doing all this work, also taught. She was the only woman in the village who could read and write. So because she was literate, she had a great deal of prestige. The townspeople and the peasants brought her their deeds, their any legal papers, army papers, death certificates, and she would teach them how to sign. She tells me stories about tying a string to her ankle to the cradle so she could rock the baby while she was teaching, because it was always a baby. My grandmother milked the cow, and every autumn, the newborn calf was slaughtered, and this is how the family ate through the winter and up until the next spring. The shochet came to their village at a certain time in that season and butchered the calf, and each section was wrapped with paper and sawdust and buried beneath the frost line. So you see, they were preserving food by freezing before Bird's Eye. My mother said, you always knew when the Passover was coming, but you got the good food then. The good stuff was buried far below. The things that had to be eaten immediately were on the top, like tripe, lungs, heart. And even the little children were not exempt from work. My mother told me how they would gather at the winter evenings around the table by candlelight, and the little girls would flick feathers to stuff pillows and the feather beds that were used instead of mattresses. The little kids slept above the hearth. There was a brick platform over this long open oven where all the cooking was done and provided heat for the house. It was a little 3-room house. Grandma and Grandpa had the only bedroom. There was the main kitchen where everybody worked and lived, and a small parlor that was saved for occasions. The older children slept on pallets on the floor. But the little kids, there were no play dates. There was no quality time for children. In large families like that, the older kids took care of the younger ones, and the younger ones roamed. They roamed in the woods, by the creek, in the little orchard. They were on their own. And I wonder if that isn't a good idea sometimes when I see how young mothers book every hour of their children's lives with meaningful activities and lessons. Children have to have time to dream and observe. That's how they learn about life. That's how they learn about relationships. I remember as a child sitting in the corner and listening to my mother and her sisters gab and gossip about everything, their marital problems, their financial problems, how hard the labor pains were, gossip about the neighbors. And to me it was fascinating. And I know I learned a lot because I didn't believe everything they said. I knew a lot of it was exaggeration just to entertain each other. But it gave me a scope of the world that I was going to enter in. Well, the Rav was called to Chicago because many of his congregants had settled in Chicago, and they wanted their own style of worship and their own melodies, so they sent for their Rav, Mordecai Zevin. And he came with his older sons, and they formed a congregation on 13th Street. And he was evidently a very important figure because all the Bet Dins in Chicago, that was the Jewish court, was held in his apartment. Now, the rest of the family was eager to also come to America. And my grandmother and grandfather sent their 2 oldest children first, my Uncle Ben and my Aunt Mary, with their father to come to America to earn enough money to bring my grandma and all the little girls. Well, they did. They did what many immigrants did. Ben, as a teenager, became a peddler. People who didn't have language, they just went to the wholesaler who fitted them with a tray that had notions like shoelaces, thread, needles, little household gadgets, hairpins, and they didn't need the language. They would knock on the back door. The mistress of the house came and she looked, and if she wanted something, she'd buy it, she'd give him the coins. And my aunt, who was maybe 15 years old, went to work in a sweatshop. A couple of years later, they had saved enough money to bring their mother and their little sisters. Now, my mother said they came first class, but my mother exaggerated it. Maybe it was cabin class. But I always wondered why we could never trace the family at Ellis Island. And my mother's passport said Baltimore. I found later that the only ones who went to Ellis Island were the steerage passengers. Anybody who came not in steerage could come where their ship was booked to land. So they landed in Baltimore. Well, my mother tells very funny stories about the adventures on the boat. My grandmother never left the stateroom. She was very seasick, and she wouldn't trust the food on the boat to be kosher, so kosher enough. So she brought bread, hard-boiled eggs, maybe some herring, and that's what she lived on, with fruit, until they landed in Baltimore. But the little girls were free to roam around the ship. Now, they didn't know. They were between the ages of 5 and 11. They didn't know that you go to the dining room for a meal. As they roamed the ship, they saw waiters with trays. So they would filch food off the tray, and that's how they ate. My mother said they went to the railing many times, holding the fruit and whatever else they had, and they noticed that the passengers from steerage held up their hands begging for the food. So my mother and her sisters used to filch more food and throw it down to the steerage passengers. When they landed in Baltimore, my grandmother gathered the little girls around her, and as they're disembarking, she sees on the docks African Americans who were stevedores, porters, and she was shocked. She'd never seen a black person. She gathered her children around her and she said, "Wir gehen daheim! Wir schwarz in America! We're going home. You turned black in America."